Welcome to the Space Artifacts podcast, and my name is Mark Yates.
And my name is Michael Warner, and in this podcast we share our collections of rare mission artifacts, and we tell stories of their role in the historic voyages of humans in outer space. Podcast 1, the manuals that saved Apollo 13. Now, in the news at the moment, Mark, the date of May the 27th is blinking away. It's an exciting date. Do you want to tell us just a bit more about what's about to happen?
Yeah, I mean, it's really exciting. So this Wednesday coming up, of course, SpaceX are planning their first manned launch. Now, this is critically important not only for SpaceX, who've been pushing for this for a number of years, but also critically for NASA and then fundamentally for America. Strategically very, very important. It'll be the first flight of a manned crew from American soil since 2011, when the last space shuttle mission, STS-135, took off. So all eyes are really on the crew of two. The Dragon capsule itself, a very capable vehicle, modeled more like the Apollo command module than the space shuttle. And we'll see how they get on with their inaugural test flight.
Yes, so Mark, I don't know whether you and I are going to be together to watch that, but I find it extremely exciting. I mean, it's a big step forward. Now, the link between that news and the artifacts we are sharing today is really about the concept of redundancy. So they're going to be flying into low Earth orbit, and presumably they have backup procedures for when things don't go according to plan. And as we know, that is the big story of Apollo 13. Now, on my left here are two very rare, unique space artifacts. I have the Lunar Module Systems Evaluation Checklist from Apollo 9 and the Mission Control Lunar Module Contingency Checklist from Apollo 13. This manual here was owned by Jim McDivitt, the commander of Apollo 9, which tested out the entire Apollo system, that's the Saturn V rocket, the lunar module, command module, and service module in lower Earth's orbit, and went through all the different systems, including the system that related to the lunar module and the command module, and you can see them here behind me on my right, docked together, and a burn of the lunar module descent engine. And the story we want to tell you in this podcast is how the procedures that were developed in Apollo 9 became contingency procedures, redundancy procedures for Apollo 13. So I think what would be good now is to ask Mark if you just talk us through a little bit about the flight plan. There's an image for those who want to go on YouTube up right now of the oxygen tank having exploded on the service module, and an image of the service module as it was jettisoned just before entry back into the Earth's atmosphere. But Mark, I wonder if you could pick up the story in a moment and talk us through the first half of the flight plan of Apollo 13, so that we can then take different parts of these manuals and link them to the flight plan.
Okay, so what we're looking at here is a traditional trajectory that all flights to the moon had flown. Apollo 11 and 12, of course, had flown this successfully and landed the year before. Apollo 13 was en route and was flying a very routine mission. The trajectory, though, to the moon was slightly different. It didn't have the inbuilt contingency in the event that if the astronauts could not fire a rocket engine or literally took their hands off the wheel, that they would automatically return back to Earth and re-entry. Apollo 13 had what was called a non-return trajectory. It was really a good indication of just how brave the flight controllers were becoming. And in fact, it did have that feeling of routine. The flight controllers themselves saying, guys, you're sending us to sleep down there. Unfortunately, it didn't take long, about 55 hours into the mission before things went wrong very, very quickly. They had an oxygen tank explosion, which crippled the mothership and was sent both the spacecraft docked together, tumbling around in space. So
what happened? So what happened inside the crafts at that point there, when after the oxygen tank had exploded?
Well, they'd experienced all kinds of bangs and shimmies and various rapid rotations in the orientation of the spacecraft. They were trying to fight that. Of course, this thing was still propulsive. It was acting like a low impulse rocket engine effectively, and we're sending them all over, cartwheeling around space. It was very hard for them to actually get a visual cue out of the window because there was all kinds of debris floating by. So There couldn't be star sightings and that kind of thing. And so very quickly, the traditional mission plan was basically thrown away, and they reached for the all-important contingency checklist. Now, of course, they had that lunar module contingency checklist with them on the spacecraft, and an identical copy down on the ground.
Great. So there they are, having retreated into the lunar module, having deactivated the power systems in the command module to save electricity for those systems, and they've turned to the contingency checklist. This document here, Lunar Module Contingency Checklist, which was in the lunar module. Now, a duplicate of that, owned by Charlie Duke, was down in mission control. And the manual acted as a conduit, like a funnel, all across mission control, and then the contractors were woken up all over the US, and everyone was busy creating and devising modifications and improvisations to the contingency checklist. Some of those were tested in simulators, some were calculations, and they all fed through Charlie Duke at Capcom. Before we move to hear a little bit about Charlie Duke's role, I just want to share with you the story of how the Apollo 9 is talking to Apollo 13. The critical procedure that helped rescue Apollo 13 was first tested and first devised for Apollo 9, and it was a docked dips burn. So docked, as we've seen in the model behind us here, where the lunar module is docked to the command module, that's a burn where those are docked together, and the dips bit is the descent propulsion system, DPS burn. So you're burning the lunar module descent engine designed to land on the moon, but you're burning it as a contingency procedure attached to the command and service module. And there's an image on the screen for those of you who go and listen to us on YouTube, and you can see the relevant pages in these two manuals talking to each other, the test in the lunar module and how that informed the equivalent procedures in the contingency checklist. And then we're going to hear in a moment, on screen, a video of Eugene Kranz, the flight director at the time, in a press conference during the middle of the crisis, explaining how the procedures in this manual had to be improvised and changed. And he was worried about the volume of changes to the contingency checklist. And he mentions in this clip that he had confidence in those changes because they had been practiced before in Apollo 9.
Okay, let's close it with John Harris.
What single factor, if any, is giving you the most concern at this time?
See, it's probably one that I'd say the one thing, if anything, is bothering me is a large amount of checklist changes we're making. That's why we're always trying to stay several days ahead of them and verify them in the simulators, because once you've got tried and true procedures, you like to stay with them. And I think we've gone through the major portion of the checklist changes now, so I think we're pretty much over the hump from that standpoint. It's always nice to be operating in a mode where where you're actually using procedures you've used before, and that's a good way to be.
By checklist, you mean re-entry checklist? Does that mean the re-entry is giving you concern?
No. I'm saying all the checklist changes we had made up to date. From a standpoint of discomfort, that was about the major item, because I think we felt we had a good handle on how to manage the systems now and how to go about making this burn. We had made long dock dips burns, for instance, back in the Apollo 9 mission. So we were pretty confident of those procedures.
Thank you very much, Jim.
And if you recall what was just said there, he referred both to the contingency checklist and to the referencing back to Apollo 9, where they've been practicing the equivalent maneuver. And it is worth pointing out that these artifacts, not only, of course, are they unique, this one is flown in Earth's orbit and this one used by Charlie Duke, is that they are intact, complete, and heavily annotated, with all of the changes in both the missions that was required. And that's what makes these documents so exciting. You can almost picture the moment where they were making many of these changes. And we have audio archives supporting that. And actually, this is a good point to hand back to Mark. And if you I think, know a bit more about Charlie Duke and his role as Capcom in Apollo 13. There's an image of him up on the screen at the moment. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about him and that role he played in Apollo 13?
Sure. I mean, the Capcom stood for Capsule Communicator, and this is something that had been part of tradition really in Houston Mission Control since the Mercury days. And really, there was only one person allowed to communicate with the spacecraft, and tradition had it that was an astronaut. He would understand terminology, and also, of course, as an astronaut would understand how the crew might be thinking, reactions, what information they might be needing, that kind of thing. Now, Charlie Duke, of course, by this point had not flown in space, but he had actually been a capsule communicator during Apollo 10, during their rehearsal for the moon landing. And it was Neil Armstrong who'd actually asked personally for Charlie Duke to be available for the Apollo 11 landing. So when you actually hear the voice saying, Roger, tranquility, we copy you on the ground, that was Charlie Duke.
That's
so by this,
yeah, I didn't know that.
Yeah. So an very accomplished astronaut by this point. He was also part of the backup crew for Apollo 13. Now, part of the Apollo backup crew, of course, was Jack Schweikart, who was swapped out for Ken Mattingly because of the episode with the potential exposure to measles. But at this point, Charlie Duke now is the Capcom and was part of the support crew. So he is working round the clock with his backup commander, John Young, tirelessly working through this contingency procedure and using the simulators to try and replicate the problem that they were experiencing with the spacecraft.
And what
work through
makes
these
that
procedures.
really interesting, Mark, what makes that really interesting is he's coming out of the simulator, rushing upstairs, going back into his role as Capcom, and reading up procedures which he has just tested himself in the simulator. And what we're going to do now on screen is show you just a couple of pages from the manual where you can see that he's been writing in hand when they're supposed to be read up. So that's the time, GET, ground elapsed time, and then what the purpose of the read up is. So you can see one there that says PC +2, pericynthion +2. That was the big burn just after they'd come round from the back of the moon, which would speed up their return journey by 10 hours, change their landing zone from the Indian to the Pacific Ocean, and was absolutely critical to the final rescue of Apollo 13. And what Mark and I enjoy doing is researching these artifacts, and a key source of critical information to bring these objects to life are the transcripts of the ground-to-air communications, and not just the written transcripts, which we put up on the screen now, but also the audio of the Capcom reading up to the astronauts and the astronauts reading back the procedures.
I think one of the other key things is that there was obviously a very short period of time to prepare these procedures and made sure they worked, but also they had to allow enough time to read them up. There was no way that these procedures could be uploaded or printed out in the spacecraft. So they had to be read up line by line. And of course, it was desperately important that they were read back as well to make sure that they were complete, correct. You get one mistake, one line out of sequence or something, and you could have actually made things worse. And I think that again proves the sort of the discipline under extreme pressure of both the Capcom, Houston, and the crew of Apollo 13.
Well, I'll tell you, let's take an actual example of that. Let's hear now the audio archive of the read up from Charlie Duke to Fred Hayes on the last burn of the descent engine, which was for a mid-course correction, which they needed to do to get the eventual trajectory and the angle coming into Earth correctly. And this is being made famous in the film Apollo 13, of course. And it's referred to as the Earth in the window burn. And what you had was the Earth being held in the front window of the lunar module to control pitch and yaw, and on the side you had a portion, a segment of the sun held in one of the alignment telescopes to control the roll. And we're going to hear now Charlie Duke reading up a summary of what the intent was behind these procedures.
Understand. What we're really trying to do is get you in a posture so that when you see the Earth come through the window, you can damper out and hold the Earth in the window. Proceeding on to the rest of page 29 under RCS press, scratch the entire 3 steps as printed. On page 30, scratch step 4 under the RCS press. Over.
So what we're doing in these podcasts is presenting one or two artifacts as the centerpiece of the story for each episode. And then what we're going to do is bring in other objects, other artifacts from our collections related to the theme of the episode. And in this case, of course, it's Apollo 13. So what I'd like to do now is, Mark, I know you've been busy burying away in your collection, putting out some interesting items. And I think you have, why don't you tell the story? It's something that someone wore on a wrist in space on this mission.
Okay, so here we have another artifact, and this one is far more personal, and actually was worn on the wrist of Jack Schweikart as a watch strap. It's an 18-inch piece of Velcro that would be worn around the arm of his spacesuit, which is why it's so long. It could be shortened and worn around his wrist when he was just wearing flight overalls. And we're about to see a video of that. But he used that watch, this Omega, to actually time the duration of the burns, these critical burns that would get the crew.
The ones we've just been watching. The
exactly right.
Burn. Yeah.
Exactly right. And you would have seen him in the film. He's actually sat there in a lunar module making these precise timings, because it was all about energy, and energy was a function of time. What's lovely was, of course, he wore this throughout the whole mission. He kept it as part of his personal mementos. And actually, this came up to auction about 5 or 6 years ago. There was a fair bit of research needed on my part to actually understand exactly where it come from. It came from his estate. Jack Schweikart, of course, had died in the 80s, I believe.
And there's an important point there, isn't there? We talked about provenance earlier on. Sometimes the provenance of his artifacts is staring you in the face. It's a letter signed by the astronaut, holding, and there's a photo going with it, holding the provenance letter and the artifact. But sometimes the artifacts are valid, but you've got to do a lot more research, Mark. Is that what you're saying?
I think that's exactly.
I think provenance behind it.
It's exactly right. Sometimes some pieces will come up. I mean, it's like any sort of collecting stream, if you like. You have to understand the context of what is a fairly inanimate object. It may have been a very personal memento, just one individual, but you have to understand the history behind it. And actually, once you get to that point and you can prove that provenance, as a collector, don't stop. Keep going, because there is so much more research that can be done. Actually, going through the 16mm cine films of the Apollo 13 mission, we actually found this clip, which shows him wearing that exact watch strap. And that helps to bring the artifact to life. I mean, and Michael's point earlier on, just to build on that, hugely important, actually, to find the audio transcripts and match them to these physical procedures that Michael have got. It's tremendous. It reanimates those objects. It brings it back to life. And it tells the story of Apollo 13 from an angle which I really don't think we've seen many examples.
Excellent. So let's watch this clip.
Now, as part of that 60mm footage, we actually see a component that had to be manufactured by the crew to keep them alive on the return from the moon to the Earth. And at this point, I think, Michael, you really need to introduce that.
Yeah, so I've been in my treasure chest and I've pulled out something that looks a lot like this. So what Mark was referring to, and I'm sure some of you already realize where he was going, it's a lithium hydroxide canister that scrubs, cleans the air of carbon dioxide. It's pretty heavy. I'd say about 3-4 kilograms. And of course, you all know the story. They had to fit a square hole into a round peg into a square hole. And basically they had to take this out of the command module and fit it into the socket on the lunar module for the equivalent scrubber, because there were 3 of them in the lunar module. There should have been 2. They were there for 6 days instead of 3 days, and they needed a lot more of this scrubbing going on. So the clip coming now is of Fred Hayes, I think, doing a backward somersault or something similar to that. And if you look closely to his left, you'll see the flown version of that artifact on board the lunar module of Apollo 13.
Mid-course correction. The flight path angle at entry is within the entry corridor. The flight path angle currently appears to be minus 6.24 degrees at entry interface. The nominal flight path angle is 6.5.
So we could see the canister there from that footage. And I've always been fascinated by two, if you like, types of artifacts. There are the manuals and the documents, annotated, some flown, some at mission control, which tell their own story. And then there are the physical objects. If they've been flown, then I wouldn't be handling it like this. I'd be having sterilized gloves. But just the physicality of these objects. And in that vein, I think, Mark, you've been pulled something out the hat for us as well, to do with the end part of the flight plan and the splashdown.
Now, of course, at this point, the command module spacecraft, astronauts, and the lunar module still attached, heading back to Earth, ready for a splashdown. Now, the lunar module was keeping them alive and supplying oxygen and, of course, power. It would present a final problem, but we'll come back to that a little bit later. But actually, behind me is a splashdown cap and jacket that were worn by one of NASA's most senior people. In fact, the most senior person on the recovery carrier, the USS Iwo Jima. Now, Randy Stone, who had previously owned these, was going to be tasked with running the quarantine procedures and containment of the crew, because they were always worried they're going to be bringing back lunar germs. They'd done the same thing with Apollo 11 and 12. But actually, by one upside of not landing on the moon, if there was a one, was the fact they didn't have to go into a 3-week lunar lockdown. So Randy Stone's job was quickly rewritten on the spot, and he was there really to make sure the crew were recovered successfully, and then looking after their well-being. Of course, they'd had very little to eat.
So these were worn by Randy Stone on the aircraft carrier during splashdown.
Exactly right. On the USS Iwo Jima, of course, every crewman would have been wearing one of these caps and probably one of these jackets. Tremendous sense of pride, of course, in the safe recovery of the crew. But Randy Stone's real priority would have been making sure that the crew were okay. Fred Hayes was known to be quite ill at this point, was suffering from a urinary infection. But also the crew had really had very little to eat, very little sleep, and were badly dehydrated. So here is a lovely memento from NASA's most senior person on the spot. What it must have been a fantastic day. In fact, we found some footage that we're going to cut to in a minute, which shows CBS live coverage narrated by Walter Cronkite of the crew being welcomed back onto the flight deck of the USS Iwo Jima. And I think really, as amazing these Apollo artifacts are, yes, to fly is one thing. They don't, unflown artifacts still have a wonderful story to tell.
Very good. That's salty. That's very good. That's what they did. They got the blue suits. They didn't have those available.
There's applause here in mission control and cheers going on.
There they are, Jim Lovell in the lead. And then Swigert, isn't it?
That's Jack, yes.
Yeah, and then Fred Hayes behind, yeah.
Somebody improvised beautifully. They got patches and everything.
I want to say just a sweet talk to you, not just from the recovery force, but millions and millions of people all over the world. It undoubtedly has to be one of the personally happy moments. We're glad you could make it, boys. This is Gary Kirsten. Yep. I must commend you on your navigation.
If you recall, a little while ago, Mark said that the lunar module presented one last problem. And this is because it was attached to the command module and ended up coming into the Earth's atmosphere, having been first jettisoned, when in fact it was supposed to be left on the lunar surface. Now, the problem it was presenting was because of the power unit, which was a flask of plutonium, which had been intended to be used to power electricity to experiments for 10 years on the lunar surface. Now, this flask of plutonium was, of course, attached to the lunar module, and there's an image of Apollo 14. This is Alan Shepard behind me here, pulling that flask off the side of the lunar module on the surface of the moon. This flask in Apollo 13 was still attached to the lunar module. The lunar module is jettisoned, it starts to break up and tumble its way, the pieces of it, through the atmosphere. And the design of that flask was such that it would survive that type of crisis, primarily designed in the thought that there could be an abort during launch, that it would have to survive. And so the artifact, and now we put up an image of it on the screen, it's just a memo. It's not the most expensive artifact in the collection, but it's fascinating. It's the Atomic Commission recording that they had flown air sampling flights over the landing trajectory of the lunar module as it broke up to see if that flask had been damaged in the atmosphere and released radiation. And so they were hoping for a negative result, like no radiation. That is what they found. That is what the memo tells. And there's a diagram at the end of the memo, which we've just put up, which shows that that flask is somewhere in a 10-kilometer deep trench, 200 miles south of the Fiji Islands, with radiation of a half-life of 850 years.
Okay, so that brings us to the end of this podcast on Apollo 13. And actually, we've shown you 2 flown artifacts and 3 unflown artifacts. And they've all been able to tell a story of Apollo 13, we hope, from a slightly different angle than what you may have seen in the past. And I think if you're looking for further information, I would like to refer you to this article that Michael felt compelled to write on the anniversary, the 50th anniversary of Apollo 13, which explains more about the manuals and their role in really saving the day for Apollo 13.
Thank you very much, Mark. Yes, it's an article in here. It's Spaceflight. It's British Interplanetary Society's publication. And yes, I spent a while over the Christmas holidays beavering away and expanding on the stories of how these 2 manuals talk to each other. You will put up the details of how to track down that article and some other links at the end of this podcast. But thank you so much for joining us today. But Mark, why don't you sort of finish up by telling us what's on the next episode?
Well, the next time we'd like to talk to you about the 3rd Apollo spacecraft. Of course, everyone knows about the command module and the lunar module, but there was a 3rd, possibly the smallest, and actually a very, very interesting piece of design. Something that we'd like to share with you next time. Thanks for watching.
Thank you.
Now, I mean, Michael, I love your Apollo 9 manual. I mean, Apollo 9, of course, was called the ultimate test flight of the lunar module to really give it a green light to fly in lunar orbit and then land on the moon. And of course, you've got a lovely little story where that manual's been part of your collection for a while. You were able to reunite that with one of the astronauts that flew on the mission.
Yeah, so that's Rushdie Swaggart. It was thanks to you, because you said you gave me a call one day, so he's in London. Get down there. And I went. I shot down. I'm not really keen on this sort of groupie thing with astronauts, if I'm honest. But I thought, come on, do it. So I went, paid my money, entrance fee, and there he is. And I met Al Warden at the same time, which is pretty exciting. So I met Rushdie Swaggart, and he picked it up. He goes, well, it's fantastic seeing that again. I was thinking, why didn't I have that video? Why hadn't I listened to Mark, who said, yeah, you should always have someone videoing when you talk to the astronauts. Anyway, he picked it up and he wrote on it, fantastic seeing this again in some Sharpie pen all the way across the bottom half, which was clear, of one of the most important pages. And I remember thinking, I'm not so sure that was a good idea. And it was a bit of a balance between, a historic artifact, wear rubber gloves before you even breathe on it, versus the actual astronaut who actually annotated that document in Earth's orbit as part of the plans for the Apollo mission. So I think on balance, he wins. But I did sort of watch him do it, sort of slightly intrepid as to what have I just encouraged, the sort of the undermining of an historic artifact. But anyway, thanks, Mark. Yeah, it's a fabulous manual.